The main character's name is Yu Chonin. She is a modest, beautiful girl who works as an ordinary office worker. Day by day, she tried to live life to the fullest, to enjoy every moment. But one day, coming home from work and coming into a crosswalk, a huge truck hit her. Somehow she woke up and realized she'd gotten into an extra chapter of a web novel she'd read the day before she passed away. Right now, the main character is making out with some guy with white hair. When they finished, Yu Chonin looked at the guy and was amazed because he was Prince Albert Gray. At that moment, memories of the story began to surface in her mind, and she remembered that her character in the story was a common maid. She was also in complete shock and didn't realize what she had just done to the prince. Prince Albert Gray is a man of distinguished appearance and very good swordsmanship skills, in which he surpassed even the masters of the sword. Having such a character, he was able to win the love of all the people, but the king envied the prince and hated him. Besides, Albert was not the king's own son, and the king, whose name is Rostrath Gray, was a eunuch. However, the fact that he couldn't be Albert's father was common knowledge, and it wasn't even hidden. The king suffered from a sense of inferiority and chose a successor who seemed worthless, namely Albert Gray. Albert, who had lost his birth parents, was just a defenseless orphan. Naturally, the king could not have imagined that Albert would have a brilliant future in which all the people would love him. Then the king, whose mind was clouded with hatred and envy of his unborn son, slandered and imprisoned the prince in a tower. Into the tower, upon which 30 high magicians had cast a sealing spell. So Albert was deserted, and his loneliness was shared only by his maid, who was also confined to the tower of the... Also, the king wanted to break the prince completely, so he chose Albert, a maid who was crazy about him, and that maid turned out to be the protagonist. In addition, the king even gave this maid a magic wand, with which she could do whatever she wanted. The wand is a tool to control Albert's body. It was also the key to get into the tower, so Albert could not even leave or enter the kitchen without the maid's permission, and the prince's whole life was in her hands. First light embraces, then kisses, and even more, the maid used everything to mess with the prince's head. But the prince certainly wasn't a fool. After he skillfully seduced the maid, he managed to get the power of the rod. And a year after his imprisonment, Albert broke out of that tower. Also, all those years he was imprisoned in that tower, he hid his hatred for that maid in order to get the rod. And the first thing he did when he left the tower, he dealt with the maid. Just like that, without making a sound, the maid died a miserable death worthy of a worthless fiend. Watching the prince, the protagonist, I realized that the worthless villain was a foregone conclusion, and she'd moved into the body of Rosa Atius. At that moment, Albert was trying to seduce the girl by asking her if she wanted more kisses. Rose tried to distance herself from the guy and said that she thought it was a good place to stop, and she didn't understand how she could have moved at the exact moment she was showing the wand to the prince. Approaching the girl, the prince asked her if she would show him this magic wand, but the girl realized that she couldn't just give it away. However, being under the pressure of this beautiful man, she had feelings for him that she couldn't get rid of. So thinking her heart would stop before her head fell off her shoulders, she decided to give the prince the rod. Watching Albert use the power of that rod, she realized that she had just been in this body and was already tempting fate. After a while, being in her room, the protagonist tried to calm down and thought about the fact that she had changed into this body. But if she keeps her composure, she can quite manage it. Besides, Albert has a claim to the throne, so staying near him is like playing the lottery. She decided to make a pact with him, namely, she would not take away his rod. But on the contrary, she would give it to him and offer to unite. In return, she would ask for guarantees that he would keep her life and provide her with a secure old age. Fortunately, it hasn't been more than a week since the prince's imprisonment, which means it's not too late to change their relationship. Going downstairs, she saw the prince, who immediately asked the maid if she wanted anything else, to which the girl replied that she didn't need anything. Also, looking at the guy's smile, she remembered that it was a predator's smile that you have to be careful with. Touching his lips with his hand, the prince thought that the maids just didn't like his kiss, for he thought he was very good at it. Heard it? Rosa again, she began to feel somehow strange, and blushingly told the prince to do what he ought not to do. That left the prince a little puzzled, and he wondered why the girl had come downstairs and what she wanted to talk to him about. At that moment, Rosa took out a contract and immediately put it on the table, saying she wanted to make a deal with Albert. When Albert heard that, he realized that the maid probably wanted something in exchange for his body, which surprised the girl a little, since in the affair it quickly came to bed, but in that case he would deal with her quickly, so she should avoid it. Waving her hands, she said she wasn't going to share Albert's bed, no way. But the prince, smiling his hunter's smile to the blushing heroine's face, said he knew perfectly well that she liked him. At that moment, Rosa thought that she was not the maid the prince was used to living with, but a completely different person, and she had no feelings for him. But if she said this to the prince, he would take her for a mad woman. Besides, all she wants right now is to get out of that tower as fast as possible. So the protagonist asked the prince to take a look at the treaty. Looking at this document, the prince was a little surprised, for the girl wanted assurances that he would keep her alive and ensure her a secure old age. The girl also confidently declared that she wanted more than anyone to get Albert out of that tower, so she wanted to help him get out. She added that the prince would only have to give her enough money to live in some village, eat good food, and enjoy her life. In addition, Rose asked Albert to read this contract to the end, as there was a clause guaranteeing that there would be no touching without the consent of both parties. At that moment, Albert was completely bewildered and couldn't believe that the man in front of him was still the same man. He listened to the protagonist say that the moment they kissed, she created that she was doing wrong to the prince, and she realized that she was just getting closer to her deathbed, which surprised the prince a little. And she explained that she thought he might be able to escape someday. And when that happens, the girl must not be able to survive. Albert was puzzled. He didn't understand what the maid was talking about, and what an ordinary kiss had to do with her not surviving. Then he stood up and approached the maid and began to touch her face tenderly, saying that he had liked her from the first time they met. At that moment, Rosa tried to calm herself, as she more than realized that the prince was just trying to seduce her. Also, the prince asked the girl to come closer to him, but she didn't understand why she should do that, and she asked the guy if she was going to kiss her again. Also, she realized that it was an important moment to get the trust of the prince. On hearing this, the prince replied that he certainly wished to kiss her, and asked the girl if she did not mind, to which the girl replied that it's not that she doesn't mind, but she realizes he's going to do it because he trusts her, and all he wants to do is see if she reacts to that kiss the same way she did before or not. Albert was a little surprised to hear this and said he didn't know what had happened to Rose, but it was as if she had become a different person, to which the girl replied that some people change right in front of their eyes, and that it can happen. Agreeing with the girl, Albert immediately grabbed her by the waist, and looking her straight in the eyes, said that the maids were right. However, he still hadn't checked her, and he would need to do another experiment. And if Rosa doesn't want to do it, she should just say. Then the heroes fell on the bed and began to kiss passionately. However, the protagonist was in complete bewilderment and wanted as soon as possible for it to end. After a while, they finally finished kissing. Rose just lay on the bed in utter bewilderment, glad that it was finally over. At that moment, Albert asked the girl if he could have another look at the contract, to which the girl immediately agreed. Being at the table, the prince wondered how he could be sure that the maid would fulfill the terms of the contract, to which the girl, showing him the contract, asked him to simply sign it with magic. Hearing this, Albert was a little surprised and didn't understand how the girl knew he had magic powers. Since the protagonist has read the novel, she knows that Albert keeps the fact that he can use magical power in the plan, but he hasn't told a soul about it. So smiling, she replied that she was just very guessing. She also explained to the prince that the reason he wanted to see the rod so badly was because he was going to try to dispel its magic. Grinning, Albert was amazed at the maid's intelligence, and he didn't even know she could think of such an. At that moment, the principal wondered why the maid had decided to show him the magic rod, since there was no profit in it for her. But that the girl worriedly replied that she had just lost her mind over his charms. Albert said that unfortunately his magic doesn't work here, so he needs to study the rod carefully. At that moment, Rosa stood up and approached the prince, realizing that it would be on her conscience to fulfill the terms of the agreement, to which the prince replied that if he trusted her, he would have agreed to it. At that moment, the maid began to tremble a little, but she knew not to give in to fear. So she explained to the prince that she had done everything in her power, namely to draw up a mutually beneficial treaty, and had even passed the kiss test. So the girl doesn't understand why Albert won't believe her. And if it goes on like this, it'll only be worse for him. The maid began to tell the prince that they were now in the same position, for they were both now imprisoned in this tower. But the girl was willing to accept all the terms if the prince would give her what she wanted. Rosa only needs 3 things. First, a guarantee that she'll be kept alive when she's released from the tower. Secondly, money so that she can live the rest of her life well and not depend on anyone. And thirdly, immunity, as she cannot touch Albert. Albert must not touch her without her permission. So the girl offers these terms to the prince, because she knows he can fulfill them. And of course, they'll both pay for breaking them, and they'll have to figure out the proper punishment. So it didn't take long for the protagonist to reply that as punishment, they'd have to pay with their lives, which surprised the guy a little. She said that this way, they'd be sure to honor all the terms of the contract. Smiling and looking at Rose, I realized that she was a decent girl, which the girl immediately agreed with and added that she had always been like that. So Albert asked the maid to fetch a quill. After some time holding a quill in his hands, Albert asked the girl if she would not regret it too, for it seemed to him that they did not like his body. To which the girl replied in a calm voice that she thought any passion paled in comparison to fear for her life. Then the protagonist, generic, if that they finally managed to sign together this pact, said that hopefully they can get along during the rest of their time imprisoned in the tower, where the prince bowed to the girl and said he was counting on it too. The next day, the protagonist was doing the usual maid's business. I mean that, in accordance with the contract made yesterday, Albert is now her very powerful employer, and that is why now she is not facing imminent death after her release from this tower. Plus, Albert promised to give her enough money to last her the rest of her life. But until the plan is implemented and you have to take good care of your client. Besides, Prince shouldn't underestimate a well-traveled office worker, so she also knows the plot of this novel as well. However, Rose realized she had missed one very important detail, namely Albert, and she were now like roommates. This morning when she came out of her room and immediately saw the wet prince who apologized as he was a little late due to fencing practice. After seeing this beautiful man, the main character started to go crazy about him. I don't understand why he's walking around like that in the morning. It doesn't matter that he's a prince, he's not alone in this tower, and they definitely live here together. Also ran to the man. The main heroes did not understand how he even managed to get out of here. To which the guy replied something all thanks to the fact that the maid yesterday gave him to study the rod. The guy touched Rose's soft hair, thanked her, told her he was now free to do whatever he wanted on the second floor. The protagonist replied that she had done nothing of the sort, but she immediately turned away as she couldn't bear to look at the prince, and simply asked him to at least get dressed. Finally dressed, Albert asked if it was okay, to which the protagonist replied that now she liked everything, and he finally looked neat. Also, the maid asked the prince from now on to always expect her in such a way, adding something necessarily. Turning away, the girl didn't know whether to call them roommates, housemates, or roommates, since I'd have to live with a stranger she knew from some web novel. As she pondered, she also realized that no matter how capable Albert was, even he would need time to undo the magic of the wand and the tower. So with a disgruntled face looking at the prince, the maid decided that in order to live to this point without problems, she needed to avoid confronting Albert. So she needs to make them feel comfortable living together. Then she tells him that they need to discuss something. Namely, she wants to know his preferences. Albert was a little surprised to hear this, as they had only recently signed a contract, and the maid was already violating its terms. Then Rose laughed very loudly at what she heard, for she only wanted to know what food the prince liked, and she wondered what he was thinking that he thought she was breaking the terms of the treaty. The maid also explained that they would be here together for a day or two, and only she could enter the kitchen. So shouldn't she know at least his tastes in food? When Albert heard this, he replied that he didn't have any particular food preferences, so he told her that Rose could cook anything, which pleased her greatly. She said that tonight's menu would be Korean food, which she loves. Also, the reason the protagonist can talk about this kitchen is because this world was fictionalized by the author of the novel. Also, the main character recalled how in her past life when she read this novel, she did not understand how in a romantic fantasy, stylized in the European way, can eat Korean food. Also looking at her phone, The girl didn't understand why there were so many ingredients. But in fact, such a large number of ingredients in this novel are due to the main character named Seo Ina. She is from South Korea, and she is the one who makes Korean dishes out of all these ingredients. And with this, she has been able to win the hearts of all people. At the point in the novel when rumors of Koina spread, Albert becomes interested in him finding her, and it is from that point that the protagonist finishes this novel. So coming down the stairs, Rosa was very curious how things might work out for those two. While knocking on some door, the girl thought about the fact that Seo Ina was cooking Korean food in this novel, which meant that Albert might like it. But that wasn't her main question right now. Finally, the knights guarding this tower opened the door wondering what happened. To which Rose worriedly replied that we'll respond at 8 a.m. Monday morning. Once a week, the maid would deliver a report to the king. She would report on how she had abused Albert and detail how broken he was. And at the same time, the king sent her patrolmen and provided her with everything she needed. So passing the report to one knight, the protagonist was glad that the real Rose had already prepared this week's report. Because if she wrote the report, the king would have realized what was going on. But she had to come up with a plan to avoid getting caught in the future. Also felt as if she now had two bosses at once, Prince Albert and King Rostreth. After a couple more days, one of the knights came into the tower carrying some boxes. Finally, putting the box on the ground, he said that he had brought everything about what the protagonist had asked for last week. He also added that if she had anything else, she should just ask for it. Upon hearing this, the maid held out a small piece of paper to the knight, saying that she wanted him to bring her more of the food she had written here, which surprised the knight a little, but he immediately realized that these products were needed so that the maids could torture the prince. She explained that she was going to starve him first and then feed him spicy food, and the prince would always be at her mercy. Also, looking the knight straight to show the girl added to be sure to pass this on to his majesty, because she wants to torture Albert properly. Then the protagonist didn't go into the room Albert was in, who immediately praised her for her excellent work. He also asked the girl if she wasn't going to seriously torture him. When the maid heard that, she immediately said she had no intention of doing it, and she said it was so she wouldn't be found out. She actually needed a plausible excuse to ask for such expensive ingredients because she needs to avoid suspicion from the king. So she has only one option, and that is to pretend to be a villain. Rose has read dozens of books in the romantic fantasy genre that feature a villain, but she never thought that this knowledge could ever be of use to her. So, smiling, she asked the prince to wait for a while as he would soon taste the incredibly delicious food. But Albert didn't seem to care, but he said he was looking forward to it. He also asked what kind of food she wanted to cook, and suddenly she's really going to kill him. As he ate, the prince had a feeling that the maid had changed a lot in recent weeks. Because before she was only interested in his body, and now she's trying so hard to cook, and she's like a different person. When the protagonist heard that, she reminded the prince that she had already said it, namely when they first kissed. She realized how stupid her actions had been. Yes, and is that why Albert made a deal with her? She that the man replied that when people suddenly change, there is always a reason for it. Then Rosa realized that even now Albert didn't trust her at all. But it didn't matter much to her, for it would take a little time to prove that she wasn't the old maid, but a completely different person. Besides, she had something else on her mind right now. Then, standing up abruptly, the girl, thinking that she might be rushing things, told the Duke that she had something to tell him, and she was the one who asked him not to fall in love with her. Also, the protagonist realized that in romantic fantasy, as it is known, there is an outdated pattern. Namely, when a girl caught up in the romance changes the plot, she somehow meets the protagonist. Moreover, in the end, she falls in love with her. And it's a cliché, but Rosa doesn't want there to be feelings between her and Albert, because love with this cold-blooded man could be a tragedy for her. When Albert was 8 years old, they tried to poison him for the first time. He was born into an earl's family that was blood related to the royal house. But this family only looked noble, and their financial situation was in considerable decline. Then little Albert was quietly eating his supper, but suddenly he began to feel dreadful, which his brothers noticed and ran to him at once. But his brothers smirked and asked him who could have done this to him. While the little prince was making some miraculous recovery, his older brothers fighting over the inheritance ended up killing each other. Even Albert's parents passed away, unable to cope with their illness. but Albert thought his life would be better after being adopted by King Rostratus. But life was not so sweet for him, and eventually he was imprisoned in a tower with a crazy maid and lost his position in society. So Rosa asked herself if someone who'd lost trust in people could really love someone. At that moment, the protagonist found similarities between her life and Albert's, as she too lost her parents almost immediately after graduating from university. Namely, they were in a car accident. The girl didn't even have time to grieve, no matter how hard it was in front of others. She always pretended everything was fine, but when she was alone, she put even more effort into it. And she loved reading romans because she wanted to escape from reality and from such a horrible life. She finds herself in a strange situation that she's surprised she can adapt to immediately. But a romantic relationship with Albert is something else entirely. Eventually, the girl realized that they would only hurt each other, so she asked the prince to promise her that he would never fall in love with her. She also explained that her fears may be in vain, but they are trapped in 4 walls, just the 2 of them, so she suggests being careful. At that moment, Albert asked Rosa in a calm voice not to worry, for it was out of the question, and he promised the girl that he would never fall in love with her. When the girl heard the prince say this, she was immediately glad, for when she hears the prince say it, she is reassured, and she hopes that his attitude will not change. She also asked him not to forget her reward. At that moment, the prince noticed that the girl seemed to be in a very good mood, but the maid explained that she was just excited to finally be free of this place, because she wants to get out in the fresh air, take a walk, and talk to other people, and she wants to eat good food and meet a kind and successful man. Besides, if she had a phone and internet, she could tolerate all this, so screaming she asked the prince when he was planning the escape, which left the principal a little confused, and he said getting out of here was no problem. Plus, he was already able to weaken the sealing spell with his wand. Hearing this, the girl was in complete shock and did not understand when he had managed to weaken this spell, and rejoicing, she called him a true genius. Unable to settle down, she Alberta when they can approximately get out of the... To which the prince replied that they would be able to get out in about 3 months at least, which shocked the girl, and she didn't understand why it would take so long. Albert reasoned that if they left now, they would give the king cause to act. In the novel, Albert only managed to get out after a year, and throughout that time he worked hard on himself and his skills. When the prince was finally able to maximize his powers, he was able to reach out to his men, expand his influence, and fight back against the king. At that moment, Albert stated that he believed that imprisonment in the tower was his chance. A chance to change everything, so he would proceed carefully and slowly shade the noose around the king's neck. He also asked the maid to wait a while. He understands how hard it is for her, but she should also realize that Albert needs time. Rose smilingly replied that she understood and asked His Highness not to worry, as she would be happy to wait for that moment. But in the meantime, Albert could do as he saw fit. Time goes very fast in this tower, and yet she had not flown with Albert, and it had passed unnoticed by Rosa. Besides, it was time for Rosa to send reports to the king, which she successfully did, and the king didn't suspect a thing and even sent the food she requested. So I was happy for the girls to realize that now they could finally eat the dish, and all that time and had to cook with unknown foods, and it was very hard for her. At that moment, she decided to finally start cooking an unforgettable meal that would take away the stress of being cooped up in this tower. After some time, the protagonist was finally able to cook tteokbokki, which gave off the most pleasant odor she had ever smelled in her life. Suddenly, she ran straight to the table because she forgot something very important, and that was to add hard-boiled eggs, because nothing is better than delicious toppings with poached eggs. But she wondered if Albert could eat such a dish, so she decided to call him at once and see what his opinion of it would be. Albert was a little puzzled and didn't understand what it was, but the girl replied that it was one of her favorite dishes, and as she said, she had prepared something new today. Also, the prince noticed that today the maid seemed to be brimming with confidence, since usually when she carried the food, she looked gloomy. But she explained that she was not very experienced in cooking. Besides, she didn't understand how she was able to properly cook. Even I don't know what kind of food it was. Looking at this dish, Albert was a little surprised, as it was the first time he had ever seen such red food in his life. So he asked their maid to try it first, to which the girl replied that she was all for it and would love to do it. Besides, She hadn't eaten Korean food in a long time and even missed it. After eating one bite, she was amazed by the flavor of the dish, and in tears she told Albert that it was delicious, and she was even shocked that she was able to make such a delicious dish. Besides, she lost all her stress after such a wonderful taste, which surprised the prince a little, and Rosa explained to him that she was always stressed where she used to live, and at such times she always ate something spicy. But tteokbokki, it's her favorite spicy dish and she hasn't had it in a long time, and that makes it taste even better. Also bringing her fork closer to the prince, the maid asked him to trust her and try it, for the prince had not even had breakfast today. After finally tasting one bite, Albert began to wiggle a little, and the girl thought that he did not like the dish, but in fact it was because it was very spicy. Finally swallowed this piece, the prince said it was very spicy. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching Albert eat her dish, imagining him with cat ears, thinking he was very cute. Suddenly, she just dropped her head on the table, and on rising, she said she was all right. She thought Albert liked her dish after all. When the prince heard this, he was a little puzzled, not understanding how the maid knew all this, to which the girl replied that when the prince was in a good mood, he smiled with the left corner of his lip. Then Albert covered his mouth sharply. He didn't understand how he could be in a good mood, but the girl thought he probably still had a burning mouth because of the sharpness of the... To which the Duke replied that it was actually fine. He was also a little surprised at how easy it was to make Rosa happy, which the girl immediately agreed with, adding that it's nothing complicated, and she's happy when she's eating good food and having a good time. And she asked Albert how he was feeling, because she has noticed that when he has such a delicious dish in front of him, he is no longer sad or dreary, to which Albert agreed, saying he wasn't sure he was happy, but he felt much better than before, and he was glad he could finally share a meal with someone. The night Rosa was sleeping peacefully in her bed, she suddenly felt a pain in her stomach, so she stood up abruptly and grabbed her stomach. She didn't understand why her stomach hurt, but she immediately assumed it must be because she hadn't eaten spicy food in a long time. Also from the symptoms, it looks like she's got indigestion, there's no medication, no doctors, and the only way out of this situation. Meanwhile, Albert, instead of sleeping, was improving all his skills by reading books and gaining new knowledge. Suddenly, he heard some strange rumbling and decided to see what was going on. Walking through the corridors of the tower, he met the main character, who was very surprised to meet him in the middle of the night. She turned around and explained that she was just bored and wanted to do some sewing. However, Albert immediately noticed from the expression on the girl's face that something was wrong with her, which surprised the girl a little, and she wondered what was wrong with her face. Suddenly, she fell to the ground and the magic wand fell out of her hands. Albert even started to get a little worried about the maid and asked her what was wrong with her as she looked pale. She was also in a cold sweat, so he asked her to tell him what had happened to her. Holding her stomach and crying, Rosa replied that she had a very bad stomachache and that she must have eaten the tteokbokki too fast. The prince at once realized that it was probably indigestion, but he promised the girl that he would help her. But in order to help the girl, Albert asked her for the rod for a while, to which the girl replied that the rod was around here somewhere. Suddenly she realized that the wand had disappeared somewhere, and it was not here, to which Albert replied that one should just look more carefully, as a magic wand could not suddenly disappear. Then deliver a small needle. The protagonist asks Albert not to worry as she seeks her illness in the way she knows how. But the prince immediately grabbed her arm, not realizing what she was about to do, as it could be very dangerous. Rosé explained to the man that where she lived, to cure indigestion, they pricked her finger with a needle like this. Then it goes away easily. At that moment, Albert started smiling, saying that the girl was right and it was a very effective method, which surprised the girl a bit. After a while, the prince realized that thanks to the maid he had learned something new. He also asked the girl if she was feeling well, to which the girl replied that she felt much better now, and asked the prince for a napkin to wipe away the blood. Then, grabbing the maid's hand, Albert began to lick her finger, much to the girl's shock. Albert explained it was how they stopped the blood where he lived. Since that moment, the protagonist has not slept a wink, and it's all due to the prince's special skill of seducing people. She didn't understand how someone could just take someone else's finger and start licking it. Besides even thinking about it, Rose felt very strange, and she didn't understand where it was so raised to stop blood. Also, looking at her hand, she didn't realize what Albert was thinking then, so she assumed he was definitely flirting with her. Suddenly realized they hadn't been together that long, and it could be a cliché like, you can't deviate from the plot. However, she began to speculate that the prince might actually like her. Catching herself on this thought, the girl immediately began to think that she was probably just crazy. It's only a matter of time before a single man and woman fall for each other, especially if the man is as handsome as Albert is. But Rosa didn't want Albert to fall in love with her, so she had to get out of the tower as soon as possible and live a quiet life, and she couldn't get close to him under any circumstances. For several days, the maid determined not to get close to the prince and tried in every possible way to avoid his. So for 4 days, she just lied to Albert, saying she had urgent things to do so she couldn't talk to him, and she did everything she could to avoid him. Meanwhile, the maid is at the same table with the prince, who was unhappy that he helped the girl stop the blood, and now she probably won't meet his eyes for the rest of her life. He also added that he was just doing a little healing, and she misinterpreted it. Then, trying to hide her tears, the protagonist realized that her attempts to avoid the prince will certainly be noticed, as there is very little space in this tower. But she didn't understand what good it would do and wanted to find another way out. Meanwhile, Albert was once more eating the girl's food and savored its flavor, praising her cooking ability. While Rose was thinking that it would be nice to have someone else here besides them, she suddenly realized that they just needed something or someone to spend more time with than each other. So standing up abruptly and holding a spoon, the protagonist asked His Majesty for a pet. She explained her decision by saying that it was just the two of them and they were incredibly bored living alone in the tower. And if Albert would allow it, Rose would find some excuse to get a pet. Albert was a little surprised at the maid's suggestion, and so he pondered the matter for a long time, at the same time as the girl begged him to let her have a pet. The prince finally made up his mind that he could, which pleased the girl, and she stood up abruptly and said that there was no going back now. After a while, he opened the door of the tower, where he informed the maid that her reports had been received by the king. Also with the knight came also some little animal, which was very cute. The man also added that the dress the girl had asked for a few weeks ago was already ready, but the girl was more interested in something for the animal. Knight replied that it was just a kitten wandering around alone without its mom, and he just decided to feed it. Suddenly, this kitten was able to enter the tower, which seemed unbelievable to the heroes, as 30 mages cast a sealing spell and he entered the tower as if nothing had happened. The knight, looking at this cute kitten, asked the girl to give him back, and if he was lucky, he would survive. But of course he might run into a big beast and die. But that's nature's way. Looking at this animal, the main heroine found herself in it, because she too, like him, was all alone in her past life without parents. So she told the knight she'd take care of the kitten herself. After a while back in the tower, Rosé was very tired as she had a lot of stuff this time, and it took her a long time to bring it all in. Also, the maid ordered a lot of different dresses, and she doesn't even have 2 lifetimes to wear each one. However, turning around and looking at this animal, the main character didn't understand why she didn't see it as a kitten. This animal is white, has little horns on its head, and it has wings and a tail, and it just stood on 2 legs. So she assumed that this animal was more like some kind of dragon from some movie, and she also remembered that there was no such thing in the novel. Suddenly, this animal began to speak in human language and asked the girl if she could see his true form. Ask if she was a mage. Upon hearing this, Rosa was completely shocked and immediately took the little creature and ran up to the prince to show it to him. She was going up so fast, Albert thought the tower was going to collapse. But the girl replied that it didn't matter now and started showing him the creature, saying that the guards had brought a black kitten, but she could definitely see some kind of white creature. Plus, she added something unimportant since this creature can speak human. Seeing all this, Albert calmly told the girl that it was an ordinary dragon. Rose was amazed at what she heard, since she didn't even know there were dragons in this novel, and she realized that this world was very big. Suddenly, the girl realized that if this baby became her pet, she could finally get out of this tower, deal with the king, fly into the sky, and become a dragon rider. Then began at once to rejoice in saying that this creature was her treasure, and asked herself if luck was on her side today. At that moment, Albert asked the girl what shape she saw the dragon in, to which the girl replied that she saw a very nice white reptile with wings and horns. which seemed strange to the prince since to ordinary people like those guards, this dragon should look like an ordinary kitten. He also added that there are two types of people who can see the real appearance of the little dragon. First, those bound to him by contract, and second, mages, but Rosa is neither. But still, the maid somehow sees this dragon, which surprises the prince. Also, the girl did not understand why she has such an interesting skill, and she thinks it's because she moved into this body. She also suggests that she may have gotten powers from using the wand, which the prince agrees with, adding that it's possible since this tower is shrouded in magic. Albert added that since they now had a dragon, Rose didn't need to nurture it, as it was just a baby dragon, which surprised the girl a little, and she wondered why she shouldn't take care of it. Albert began to tell me that an adult and a baby dragon are not the same thing. When a dragon grows up, it becomes a source of magical power, which makes it so omnipotent that it can cause natural disasters or cross space and time. But the little dragon can't do any of that. He's so weak, he's ashamed to call him a dragon, and he can die easily, which is why to protect themselves, baby dragons usually disguise themselves as kittens. But if he can live for 500 years, he can become an adult, and even after that time he will have to wait, because his power will have to awaken first, but most dragons can't withstand such power and die. The prince also added that although dragons do exist, they are considered a myth by many. At that moment, the protagonist, weeping, asked the man if her pet really couldn't survive, to which the prince replied that there was only one way to do it. Judging by Albert's explanation, this is a very cruel way for a 500-year-old dragon to become an adult. It must endure a period of change all by itself. As few dragons can endure this pain in history, they are rare. Also, according to the prince, the chances of survival increase if you contract with a human and share this pain. But among mages, there are almost no those who would agree to endure unbearable pain. So many dragons can't mature and die. Albert also said that if Rosa was a genius mage, then she better not be interested in dragons. But the girl was more interested in why adult dragons don't help little ones. To which the prince replied that they can't help, and he doesn't think dragons are creatures capable of caring for others. So he thinks it's best to let that little white dragon go before he gets attached, and who knows when he'll die. Upon hearing this, the maid asked Albert in a trembling voice to give her some time to think about it. At the same time, the dragon in the girl's hands was saying that it was very warm, very magical, and very beautiful. At that moment, the girl realized that Albert was right, because she couldn't even take care of him, and if she left him, she would only hurt them both. So she decided she'd better feed him, because a well-fed ghost is better than a hungry one. While in the kitchen, Rose was making French toast for the little dragon, who liked it very much. In addition, the maid could not take her eyes off such a lovely animal and asked the dragon, "How old is he?" To which the dragon smilingly replied that he was 499 years old. Then the protagonist immediately realized that the 500th anniversary was less than a year away, which shocked her. She realized that this baby was about to turn 500 years old, which meant that he might die soon, and if she left him now, no one would take care of him, unless he was very lucky and he was a strong mage. Then the maid asked the dragon how he'd managed to survive all this time, to which the dragon replied that he'd just been sleeping. He began to say that he was a very ordinary baby dragon. He had just found a cave and slept there for 499 years, which shocked the girl, as he had been alone for such a long time in a large and dark cave. The dragon also added that since he's only a year away from growing up, he's decided to see the world before he dies. Besides, he thinks he has no reason to live anyway, but he's very afraid of pain. Then, hitting her hand loudly on the table, Rosa first told that her parents were gone too, and when she was left alone, she too began to think that she had nothing to live for. But friends and colleagues brought her out of this state and put her on her feet. With them, the girl shares happy moments and rejoiced in every little thing. It wasn't the grandiose moments that kept her afloat. It was the mundane ones. So she decided she couldn't just abandon this baby to its fate, and she had to do something to keep it alive. Taking this baby in her arms, the protagonist asked its name, to which the dragon replied that it had no name. Then the girl was a little puzzled because she didn't understand what name she could give to such a special creature. When suddenly, she got the idea to name him Winter, because he was white as snow, and the dragon even liked that name. Then the smiling maid said that Winter didn't know what the meaning of his life was, so she suggested he find it, and he'd finally have a reason to live. Now there's only one problem left, and that's how to break the news to that grumpy Albert, since he probably won't want a dragon as a pet. In the meantime, the prince was studying the magic wand. I'm trying to learn how to control its power. Suddenly he was approached by Rose, who was interested in how he was doing, to which he replied that it was going well, but because of the intricacy of the wand, he was having a little trouble, but he thought he would finish it today. Then the maid asked the prince what he was going to do when he was done, because that time he said they would only be able to escape in 3 or 4 months. To which Albert replied that he'd contact his people, and they'd decide when it was best to do it. Looking at the man, the protagonist realized that Albert had planned everything, and he is indeed a genius, even his appearance is genius. Suddenly the girl, pointing at the prince with her fingers, said that he had something on his face, namely his beauty, which surprised the guy a bit, where he was left without words. At which point the maid was forced to explain to the man that it was a joke, and she meant that he looked good, which embarrassed the guy a little bit, and he got all flushed. As it was, the girl was very happy that they would be able to escape soon, and she was even a little worried, which surprised the guy a little, and he wondered what she was going to do after she got out. To which the girl replied that she just wanted to live in a decent town, the life of a common landowner, in a small, well-being built-in town near the capital, buy lots of land and rent them out, and for herself she wants to find a small one-person home. She's going to do all this so she'll never have money problems. And she also wants to travel, to get on a ship and go on a trip. There she wants to find a famous restaurant and order the whole menu. And after the main courses, of course, she needs a dessert, because she is crazy about sweets. So Rosa decided she'd just hire a talented pastry chef to make the most delicious desserts for her. Hearing this, Albert said in a calm voice that her desire was more earthy than he thought, and the girl agreed, adding that she liked the beauty, but in fact, such an ordinary life, though happy, was the hardest thing of all. The maid also added that she can't call either his or her life ordinary, but she just wants to live to enjoy the little pleasures. Then the girl asked Albert what he was going to do after his release, but the principal didn't even know what he wanted, and simply replied that he had to become king in order to survive, which surprised Rosa a little, because if you think about it, their dreams for the future are very different. Since Albert is still a prince and the protagonist of this novel, and Rosa is only a villain and a minor character, quite naturally, they don't see each other in their future. So she realized that Albert's life would be full of hardships unlike hers. She also added that since their paths will be parted someday anyway, the girl told the prince that she had made the decision that Winter would live with her, since she would have a boring and lonely life. The Duke was surprised to hear it, and didn't even realize at first who the maid was talking about. So she was forced to explain to him that she had named the little dragon Winter, which astonished the Duke even more, for the maid had already become attached to the creature within a day. At that moment, Albert began to say that judging by what the girl is doing now, it's easy for him to imagine how it could end. And if she doesn't let him go now, she'll regret it later. But Rosa replied that she wasn't sorry she'd met the dragon after all, and she'd do everything she could to make sure he survived. However, the prince was wondering what the girl will do when the dragon fails to awaken, or if he will eventually leave her, since the chance that he will survive is only 1 in many thousands. So Albert thinks it's foolish to enter into a deliberately doomed relationship. But the maid said it's not really like that, because it's stupid to end a relationship that hasn't even started yet, and happy memories will always be remembered. So she was sure she wouldn't leave Winter, and the chance of that dragon showing up here was also 1 in 1,000, but somehow she got lucky. Suddenly the protagonist realized that she'd probably hurt Albert's feelings, and she wondered if he wasn't going to execute her because he thought her words were too impertinent. When suddenly Albert agreed to her proposal, saying that she could do as she pleased. But the girl did not understand why the prince at first so strongly opposed. Suddenly the prince stood up abruptly, and approaching the girl said that he would never have thought his maid could say such a thing. So touching her face, he said he'd be lying if he said he didn't, and he was really surprised. Suddenly he asked Rose if she could cut his hair tonight. Because of his long hair on his neck, he was very hot, which shocked the girl, and she said in shock that she had never cut anyone's hair. Plus, There's an unspoken agreement in the evening that you can't go in each other's houses. But Albert looked the girl straight in the eye and smiled, and said there was nothing wrong with it, and she would just follow his instructions, which shocked the girl even more as she realized that she had once again succumbed to his charms. As she walked down the stairs and took deep exhales and inhales, she even thought about practicing her stamina. Suddenly, Rose accidentally tripped and started to fall down the stairs, closing her eyes. She was ready to feel unbearable pain, but slowly opening her eyes, she did not understand why everything was so quiet. Looking up, she saw Albert in front of her, who had managed to catch her, and in a calm voice asked the maid to be careful. The main character felt very strange when she was pressed against the prince's body, and she also felt a very pleasant scent coming from Albert's body. Coming close to the girl's ear, the prince asked her if she was okay, but the girl, instead of talking to the guy, normally just pushed him away and ran downstairs, thanking him for saving her. While in the kitchen and cooking, the protagonist felt unbearably hot, which was immediately noticed by Winter. But instead of agreeing that it was very hot, the girl gave a thumbs up and said that she was fine. Then the dragon started waving its little paws in the direction of the protagonist, saying that now it will be much cooler, to which the girl agreed, and said that now it is indeed cooler and very fresh. At that moment, all she wanted from the survey was a regular cell phone to take a picture of this cute animal and show other people how cute it was. Winter suddenly noticed that Rosa was cooking some strange dish and wondered what it tasted like. Eating it, he was amazed at the flavor, and with a smile on his face, he said it was delicious and he wanted more. At that moment, the main character was a bit surprised, as she didn't know that even dragons ate chicken. So she asked Winter to wait a bit, as she was going to take the food and come back right away. Smiling, she thought that there was no one among men who didn't like chicken, and Albert liked it too. Suddenly, the girl noticed the prince talking to someone, and hiding behind the door, she wanted to hear what Albert was saying. Meanwhile, the prince holding a magic wand was asking someone what he had said, and asking them to repeat it. As it turned out, Albert was talking to his friends using this magic rod, and one of his friends told him that the king had ordered the village they were staying in to be burned down, and all the people living there were unfortunately killed. Also, all people think it's an accident, but those who support them are definitely not happy about what happened. Meanwhile, the girl who was outside the door was shocked by what she heard and didn't know how to react. Then she ventured into the room, where Albert immediately noticed the maid shivering, so he decided to see if she had a fever by any chance. But Rosa touched his arm and said it was okay. But Albert stated that her face showed that nothing was normal. Also, his conversation with his friend had gone on too long, and he didn't think that the main character could come over to his place. So getting close to her face, he asked her if she was really scared, to which Imor replied that she was just surprised, as she didn't know the king was such a horrible person. Also, she the prince, why he wasn't angry. To which the guy replied that of course he was angry, but that wouldn't help here, and now was the time to think about expanding his influence. So the most elaborate revenge would be to get out of here, deal with Rostrath, and become king. After the hero talked about how much the king is a terrible man, they sat down to eat, and the principal was surprised that the food today is not spicy, to which the girl replied that it was very expensive to customize this dish, as it is rarely cooked. Also, the girl asked Bold to imagine how much she thinks of him, because if he likes the food she cooks, he'll give her more land and money, which surprised Albert a little. He didn't see what food had to do with expansion and her possessions, and it's all absurd. Noticing Albert trying to eat these chicken legs with a fork, Rose started laughing, saying that this dish is eaten with hands, because if you eat it with a fork, it's very uncomfortable. Eating and looking the prince straight in the eyes, Rose listened to him say that there were many outstanding cooks in the world, but there was no one who cooked as well as the protagonist. To which the girl replied that it's not really true, and if he looked hard enough, he could probably find someone who cooks just like her. Rose also wondered if this time Albert and Seoina would fall in love again. The main character reborn into the body of Rose also changed the original plot. But Seoina is a very smart and beautiful girl, and she will be able to make Albert a worthy party. Nor did the protagonist wonder what such a reserved and elegant prince could fall in love with. At that moment, Albert noticed that Rose was thinking about something, so he decided to ask her what she was thinking about, to which the girl replied that it was nothing important, and asked the boy if he had ever fallen in love with anyone. Albert was a little embarrassed, and he didn't understand why the maid would want to know that. But he still answered that he was in love. He was very young then, and his lover had beautiful big eyes. But after he said that, he stopped right away and said they should go back to eating, which surprised Rose, and she didn't understand why Albert would stop right now. Also, looking at his face, the main thing I realized was that now he was happy and his mood had lifted. Night of that day, Albert was in his room praying, begging God to pacify this world and the souls of men unjustly sacrificed by Rostrathus. Suddenly, he noticed the wand was glowing, and when he picked it up, it appeared that his friend Liam wanted to contact him to tell him something important. Liam realized that Albert might be discouraged by today's news, but there was just one more thing he needed to tell him, to which the prince replied that everything was actually fine, and asked his friend to take it easy and tell him what happened. Liam began to tell first of all about the situation with the magic tower. Namely, he made a list of mages who cast spells on the tower, and unsure about half of them, and now he's looking for the remaining ones. Liam also worriedly added that he thought the heroes would soon have to leave the tower for a while, which left the prince a little perplexed. That's when Albert realized it was really serious, and he understood. Also looking at the rod, his friend added that he would do his best to get Albert out of the tower in one piece, and as soon as he does, he'll get rid of that annoying maid, so he wants to do everything he can to make it happen. Albert was silent for a few seconds, and then he said he understood, but asked Liam not to worry about Rosa from now on. Because she wasn't as bad as he'd imagined, said the words, Albert suggested we call it a day. Liam was a little surprised at the prince's words, but he decided to listen to him and bowed to him to end the conversation. Putting the rod back on the table, Albert too reflected that when he was first transferred here and met the maid, then all he could think about was how to deal with her quickly after his release. But now it was as if Rosie was a different person altogether, and that's the reason why his feelings for her have changed so much. He also thinks that because it's just the two of them living in a small tower, maybe his mind has gone blank. Meanwhile, the protagonist was in her room quietly writing something on a piece of paper. As it turned out, she was writing a list of ways to help Winter safely adult dragons, and the girl also thought that in order for the dragon to become strong, he should do what humans do. And first of all, you need to work on physical strength. That's when she realized she should start working out with Winter, but she only knows how to do breathing exercises. So she closed her eyes and wished she'd watched a couple of sports-related videos in her past life. Then she started to think of people around her who might have played sports, and that's when Albert came to mind. She promised herself that tomorrow morning she would ask him to tell her more about sports, or even to help her with Winter. However, the girl of course realizes that Albert just might not agree. The next day, Rose awoke early in the morning and slowly made her way downstairs towards Albert's. Suddenly, she was very surprised as she again saw Albert almost without clothes, so she felt very uncomfortable. Blushing, she asked to train the dragon, since he's the only one who knows how to play sports. She explained that this is the first step in Winter's awakening into a dragon, namely the development of physical strength. But because she's so bad at sports, Rose decides to ask Albert to help her with it. Then the prince smiling the protagonist to the horror of a ruthless mistress as she is about to throw the baby dragon to the prince and run away. So Albert suggested to the girl what to do, namely the maid would train with them, and that was the only way Albert would be ready to help the baby. Rose got upset and asked Albert to just give her less of the earth, which the prince immediately rejected, and was about to decline the offer completely. However, the girl immediately stopped him, and yelling at him said that she loves sports and is ready to do it. Smirking, Albert said that they would train every day except weekends, and they would train together early in the morning. Besides, since it was already morning, they could start the first training session. When she heard that, the girl pretended to be excited, saying that she can't wait to start training, even though she doesn't really think she's qualified to do sports at all. When Albert was about to start training, Rose said it would be better to start tomorrow, as you can't skip breakfast. So running into the kitchen, she asked Albert to take care of the baby. While in the kitchen, the protagonist was glad she was able to avoid her first workout. Also reflecting, she realized she had told Albert she loved him. However, waving her hand, she suggested that she must have heard such a thing many times. Also, she hoped that he would understand her correctly. Today is also the day when the main character will cut Albert's hair. Even though she agreed to do it, She's afraid she'll mess it up, so she's been putting it off and practicing imagining she's cutting the prince's hair. Being in the same room with Albert, Rose noticed that he had finished his work and declared confidently that she was ready to start the haircut, although in fact she realized that she wasn't ready at all. Looking at Albert's hair, Rose explained to him that his bangs had grown out a lot and must be in his eyes, so she suggested he cut his bangs too, also waving my hand in front of my eyebrows. She said the length of the quad would be below my eyebrows, but Albert understood nothing, and seizing the girl by the arm, asked her to mark the length and show the... At that moment, the protagonist felt very uncomfortable and tried to calm herself down, assuring herself that she was just cutting his hair, and she was glad that at least Albert couldn't hear her heartbeat now. Having finally realized how to cut the prince's hair, so the main thing to work on, and in a couple of minutes the new hairstyle was already ready, although it was not very different from the old one. Rose was also finally able to calm down, because during the whole process, she was very agitated and thought she was going to die. Besides, she didn't understand why Albert was staring at her for so long, and thought she had done something wrong. Suddenly the prince seized the girl's hand and, approaching her ear, asked if she would let him kiss her, which surprised Rosa a bit, and she didn't even know how to react to it, so she just decided to keep quiet. Because the girl didn't answer anything, Albert decided that she didn't mind it and kissed her passionately, at the same time as the girl didn't understand why she could never refuse him. Having finally finished kissing, the prince called the maid simply amazing, which made the girl think that Albert sees her as an uneasy maid, and he is an unusual prince before her too. Then she started repeating in her mind that they should never fall in love. But because she could no longer contain her feelings, she asked Albert if he liked her. But the man, instead of answering, asked the girl to answer his question first, namely what she thought of him, to which the girl replied that she thought he was handsome, but it wasn't love. When Albert heard that, he got a little upset and froze. Then he decided to ask why Rosa had agreed to the kiss. At that moment, the protagonist bowed her head down and quietly replied that she just couldn't refuse. She also asked the guy to answer her question. Albert stated that he cared for Rose, although he didn't understand why. Hearing this, the protagonist was a little surprised and thought that he really liked her, but she also didn't understand why. In addition, Rose from the novel tried to subjugate Albert by looking the prince straight in the eye. The main character asked him why he said that, since he promised her that he would never fall in love with her, which the man agreed, adding that although it's strange, Rose is not the same as she used to be, and Albert is not used to unrequited love, and he promised the main character that he would do everything possible to make her love him. Then Rosa was left in complete shock, and finally convinced that Albert really liked her. She looked at the wand and noticed that it was glowing again, so she told Albert that it looked like someone wanted to contact him. Trying to take the rod in his hands, Albert added that now he was definitely confessing his feelings to her, while the protagonist realized that now that they understood each other's feelings, there was no way she could pretend like she didn't understand anything anymore. Liam starts saying that Duke Mason was attacked by a dark mage. Also, the Duke is badly hurt, so Liam thinks Albert should see him in person. Looking at the protagonist, the prince admitted that although it might be a bit sudden, they'd have to go on a retreat. After a while, when all the heroes had changed, the protagonist, holding Winter in her arms, didn't understand how they could get out since there were guards outside. To which Albert turned away and replied that they would not go out the door, but would fly through the air, and he also asked the girl to follow him. When he got to the 3rd floor, Albert started to use his magic wand, waving it, and some small red lightning bolts started to come out from it. Suddenly opened some strange portal that surprised the protagonist. At that moment, Albert held out his hand to the girl, they said, and it was worth confiding in him. Finally, holding hands, they went through this portal and ended up on the roof of this tower. Rose was very happy that they had finally left the tower, and she didn't think it would be so easy to do that. Looked up at the night sky. She was struck by the beauty, for it had been a long time since she had admired the night sky and breathed fresh air. Also looking at Albert, Rose didn't understand why he wasn't so happy since they were finally able to get out of this tower, to which the Duke replied that unfortunately nothing much had changed, and they must not stop and go on, and now they must teleport to Duke Mason, who lives in the north. When she heard the Duke's name, Rosa was a little surprised, and suggested that the man must be very cold-blooded or handsome, and Albert agreed, adding that Mason was indeed quite popular with the girls. Also smirking, he asked the main character of Rushi to show interest in him, and not to talk about other men at all. The nervous protagonist told the Duke that she now wanted to try teleporting as soon as possible, at which point Albert pulled out his magic wand and cast some kind of spell that they could levitate, which left the protagonist in shock. Smiling, she realized that she too could use this sulfur if she learned the spell. Besides, all the spells are not that complicated. However, Albert explained to her that spellcasting was just one way of manifesting magic, and if one could only conjure with words, everyone would be an archmage. Suddenly the prince noticed that it was a little dark outside and he needed to light the way, so he began to use another spell. However, he stopped abruptly, as if he felt some pain, which Rose immediately noticed, and asked how Albert was feeling. But the man replied that everything was fine, and they should first of all concentrate on their and the case. But Rose is not so easily fooled. Despite the prince straight in her eyes, she thought that something didn't seem to be all right, so she decided to ask again about his well-being. Finally coming down to earth, Albert began to use another spell to create a portal. He also explained to the girl that it is a magic circle, and in it all the power is concentrated. He also added that it is important whether enough energy is put into the circle, and whether it is accurately depicted. Such a huge role is played by skills in casting spells. Finally the guy turned around and asked the girl to come over to him, which she promptly did. Being near the portal, Winter also began to feel some sort of strange feeling, as if he was being pulled in somewhere. In a moment, they were already north in front of Duke Mason's castle. Being in front of the huge gate, I didn't understand how there could be so much snow here, as it is definitely still springtime. Suddenly, knights appeared before them, who at once bowed before the heroes and saluted them. One of these knights was Baron Schubert Vergen, whom Albert had not seen for a long time. At the same moment, the prince at once asked in what condition the Duke was, to which the Baron replied that he was seriously injured. At this point, the protagonist felt a little uncomfortable because no one cared about her at all, as if she wasn't even here. Suddenly, one of the knights gave the prince a fur jacket, which he put on Rosa, saying that it is very cold now, and her lips are blue, and instead of speaking, she just sits there and is silent. The knights was just shocked, and didn't even know how to react to it. At the same time, Albert, approaching his sweetheart's ear, whispered to her that if she wanted anything, she should speak at once, and not be silent. Also placing his hand on the girl's shoulder, Albert is introduced to her knights, saying that they live together in the tower, and Rose is his faithful and devoted maid. Vergen was a bit surprised to hear that, as he remembers the main character being that annoying maid who was in league with the king and bullied the prince. And now Albert claims she's loyal to him. Also, the guy immediately apologized and bowed to the girl. They say he's a bit distracted because of the situation with the Duke, so he didn't greet Rose properly. When they were done talking, Albert turned around and said they should go inside. After a while, Rose was already inside the castle. However, she didn't even know what to do, and she was very bored. At the same time, Albert went to see Duke Mason, and Winter fell sound asleep. Suddenly, she heard someone start to enter her room, so she turned around to see who it was. As it turned out, it was Baron Vergen, who immediately approached the girl and began to shout at her. Angry, he said he didn't know what magic the heroine had used to charm His Highness, but he added that he wasn't easily fooled, so he ordered Rosa to tell him how to uncharm Albert right away, which surprised the main character a little bit, and she worryingly didn't understand what he was talking about and how she could even bewitch someone. Vergen pointed his finger at the girl and said angrily that she was the only one to know about it, which shocked Rosa even more, as this baron came to her out of the blue and spoke about some sorcery she didn't even know about. At that moment, she was very much worried, so she imagined instead of defense her boss to make it easier for her to talk to him. Concentrating, she began to assure Vergen that she did not know what kind of sorcery he was talking about, and why he was asking for her. To which the guy smirkingly replied that His Majesty didn't seem like himself. Besides, when they worked together and bonded at a distance, he never acted like that, so he thinks the main character must have drugged him with her witch potion. The protagonist, clutching her head, didn't understand why Vergen would slander her, since she really hadn't done anything. Besides, She admitted to herself that even she found Albert's behavior a little strange, as if he were actually under some kind of magical spell. At that moment, Rosa replied that she had not drugged Albert with any potion. She also added that if she had such powers, she would be a danger to them as well, which greatly surprised Vergennes, and he in a fit of anger sharply seized his sword and pointed it at the girl's throat. Rose started to hold hard from fear, and almost crying from fear, immediately started to explain that she meant that she could have dealt with them long ago. She also added that they, His Highness, just liked her special skills. That surprised the knight a bit, and he wondered what skills the protagonist was talking about. At that moment, the girl realized that the Baron most likely wanted to get Albert's favor, so this could be her chance. Calming down, she asked the Baron if he was really curious what skills she had and how she had clouded Albert's mind. Finally putting her sword away, Vergennes asked what skills she was talking about, to which the protagonist smilingly replied that she is very good at cooking, and in fact she is very good at cooking only spicy food. Hearing this, the knight was a little surprised and realized that even in 100 years he could not learn to cook deliciously, so he asked if there was any other method, to which Rose replied that she admired his beauty and ability every day, but Vergennes angrily replied that he did the same. Besides, admiring Albert's skills and appearance is a matter of course, so he realized that the girl's advice was actually useless to him, which cheered the protagonist up a bit, and she realized that apparently the Baron has a lot of respect for Albert. At that moment, the knight turned away and began to leave, saying that he would rather find out from Albert personally what he liked, and Rosa, smiling, said goodbye to him. It was already deep into the night, where the protagonist slept with the dragon. Albert suddenly approached the girl and whispered to her that it was time for them to go back to the tower. But Rose could not hear anything as she had firmly saved the Looking the girl straight in the eyes, the prince asked her if he could touch her, to which the girl replied in agreement. Then the prince started to gently touch the girl's ears while she was sleeping, causing her to instantly wake up and notice the prince looking at her intently. At that moment, she immediately stood up abruptly and was in complete shock. She didn't realize what Albert was doing next to her bed. She finally calmed down and explained to the prince that it violated their treaty, to which the prince replied that he had received permission from her, which surprised the girl a little, and she at once remembered how in a half-asleep state she had allowed the man to touch her. Looking him straight in the eye, she thought that it wasn't that she didn't like him. It was just that he didn't understand why he'd changed his attitude towards her. Winter, who had been under the blanket the whole time the heroes were talking to each other, came out from under the blanket and couldn't breathe at all. Looking at her little pet, Rose mentally asked it to save her from the prince's flirtations. However, after Albert looked at this cute creature with his hard stare, Winter immediately sped away from them, saying that they should sort out their own problems. With her head bowed down, the protagonist immediately declared that she was taking back the consent she had given, which upset Albert a little, and he left saying that he was sorry she was so against it. But unfortunately, he couldn't help it. Looking at the departing prince, Rose was very surprised since recently she thought it was useless to explain anything to him. But now he just accepted it so easily. So she wondered once again why his attitude towards her had changed so suddenly, and she even began to think that he might have been bewitched or bewitched. Rosa was also sure that if the Baron had seen the scene, he would have suspected something wrong and tried to deal with her. Suddenly Albert, who had not yet left the room, asked the girl if she was sorry to leave, to which the girl replied that the rooms were a little more spacious and beautiful, and that the tower was lonely. Albert replied that it was time for them to leave, but later he would find out if it was possible to change the interior of the tower, which made the protagonist very happy, and she thanked the prince, almost saying that she loved him. However, she managed to stop in time and simply thanked him. As she turns away from the prince, the protagonist thinks that she almost said she loves him again without realizing it. Suddenly, Albert approached the girl and asked her not to stop, but to continue what she wanted to say, and he also said that she said such things without even thinking about it. So he wants her to say that sentence without hesitation now too. Then the protagonist worriedly stated that she couldn't say those words, but she made of her hands a heart saying that this heart expresses her love. The prince was a little surprised that she didn't understand what kind of gesture it was. Also, the protagonist showed another gesture for so saying that she can still do so. Also, She was happy that she was able to get out of this awkward situation quite well. Suddenly, Vergennes informed Albert that Duke Mason had come to see them, which left the principal perplexed as he had ordered him to rest. When she heard that, Rosa immediately thought about it, because she was very curious about the Duke's looks and whether he was handsome or not. Looking at his maid, the prince noticed that she was now very agitated, but the protagonist immediately explained that she just had to observe etiquette. Suddenly, Albert came close to the face of the girl, who was very excited, and said that this was probably not the only reason why she was so excited, although the girl actually realized that the acting characters were very beautiful, and of course she was in anticipation of seeing him. Suddenly, the Duke, the protagonist, had been longing to see, finally entered the room, and she was finally able to do so. Looking at his handsome face, she wasn't the least bit disappointed, for Duke Mason was quite handsome indeed. Approaching the character, the Duke immediately asked the prince if the girl who was beside them was his devoted maid of whom he spoke, to which the girl instantly agreed. Talking to the Duke, the protagonist thought that he would be as annoyed as Vergennes or simply ignore her, but this did not happen for some reason. Looking the prince straight in the eyes, the Northern Duke explained to him that he had lost too much magical energy, and his condition could get worse, so he shouldn't have bothered to come here, so they should rest now and then come back. Also, the Baron who was near them added that although he offered his hand to the magical defense of the tower, it could be very dangerous, so no one knows when the knights who guard this tower will notice that they are missing. When the Duke heard that, he apologized immediately. Because of his mistake and inattention, they had to come here, to which the prince replied that it was all right, and he wondered if the Duke had brought what Albert had asked for. Suddenly, Duke Mason handed Albert a pouch, which surprised Rosa a little, and she didn't understand why the prince needed the pouch. Suddenly, Albert threw the girl this pouch, saying that it gave her a chance to pick up something she liked. He also explained that he had cast a magnification spell on the pouch so she could put anything in it, which left the protagonist a bit surprised, as she couldn't even believe that she could collect anything she wanted from here, and asked Albert again if he really allowed it, to which the guy replied that she could take anything she wanted. After a while, Rosa finally took everything she liked, namely almost all the things in this room. Because she had put everything in the bag, it was too heavy, and she doubted she could carry it, to which Albert replied that she should just trust in magic. When Rosé heard this, she immediately wanted to lift the heavy bag, but as it turned out, it felt no heavier than a feather, which shocked her greatly. Albert approached her and held out his hand to her, reminding her once again that it was time for them to leave. The maid was about to take the prince's hand, but she stopped herself just in time to realize that she had done so unconsciously. So she abruptly removed her hand and gave the prince the sack. However, Albert smilingly reminded Rosa that his method had worked again, which made the protagonist a little angry because she really understood that his method was working, but she couldn't resist him. After a while, the hero had already opened a portal that they used to bring him back to the tower. Turning around and looking at the prince, the protagonist asked him to go rest. Suddenly, Albert stopped and almost fainted, and replied that it was really all right, and that he should not rest. Seeing this, Rose was left in complete shock, and immediately realized that the prince was probably in such a hurry to get back to the tower, and because of that he must be looking very poorly. Also thinking about it, Rose realized that she had spent so much time with Albert but hadn't even noticed that he might be in pain, and she admitted her mistake. Winter suddenly looked at the main character with his sweet eyes and asked her what was wrong, to which the girl explained that the prince was not feeling well. Bowing his head down, the dragon replied that Albert would probably die, since when dragons get sick, they die immediately, to which the protagonist agreed, adding that most dragons can't handle the awakening power and die. But concentrating, she said with confidence that Albert would not die, and pain does not always bring death, and she would prove it. Approaching Robert, Rosie asked him if he could at least stand up, which surprised the prince, and he thought the maid thought he was so weak he couldn't even stand up on his own. So gathering all his willpower, he stood up and headed for the door, saying they should go downstairs. Watching this, the protagonist was amazed at his willpower, and she immediately wondered what Albert was going through. After a while, the prince was already in his room in bed, where he can't move at all because of his high fever. At the same time, Rose brought him water to wash himself. She was about to put a wet rag on his head. She immediately stopped because she thought Albert might take it the wrong way, so she immediately shouted that she didn't mean anything like that. When Albert saw this, he smiled and explained to the girl that she shouldn't make excuses because a fool would realize that she just wanted to help a sick person. To which Rose agreed, and she realized that she shouldn't think too much about it. And then she immediately began to help the princes. Also, the protagonist didn't understand why Albert didn't admit he was in pain when they left the tower. Plus, he always gets tired, period. And if he had said anything, she would have taken medicine to help. To which Albert said that he should not speak openly about it, as he should not admit his weaknesses, and given the burden of expectations placed on him, the position he will occupy in the future, he cannot afford it. So he thinks it's better to deal with the pain alone. Which left Rosa in complete shock. And she immediately wondered about the prince if he could take the pain. To which Albert replied that he could do it. But the further they got away from the tower, the worse he got. Albert also told her that usually he never showed his weaknesses, but now that he had fully opened up to her, he felt better, which surprised the girl a little, and she didn't understand why Albert was surprised so much. Rose also replied that she was not in pain, and the prince did not need to pretend, so if he was in pain, Albert should let her know right away. Looking at Albert's smiling face, she realized that there was something wrong, and it looked like the prince was in a lot of pain. He was weak this morning, so she thought that Albert might be under the influence of someone else's magic. Also, while Rose was thinking about it, she imagined Albert's face. However, she stopped immediately when she realized that even now, when she was just sitting in front of the sick man, she was thinking about him. Jumping up abruptly, she went to get the prince something to drink and asked him if he needed anything else. To which the prince replied that he just wanted to change into clean clothes. After a while, Rosa came back with a glass of water and new clothes, but when she saw Albert, she was horrified, as Albert felt very ill, and from his look he could no longer endure this unbearable pain. Approaching him abruptly, Rosa, almost crying, began to ask how he was feeling, but the prince at once began to reassure her, saying that he was all right, and it would all be over in about 3 days, which shocked the protagonist because 3 days is a long time for her. But Albert replied that that was the price of magic, and 3 days was still a small thing, and while changing, he asked the girl to help him, as he thought it would be difficult for him to change on his own, which surprised the girl a little, for she did not understand how Albert could call such a state of trifle. Approaching the prince's shirt, Rose began to stretch the button, and both heroes felt very uncomfortable at that moment, especially Rose. Suddenly, Albert asked the girl if she didn't answer, which startled her a little, and she immediately stopped and asked, "What happened?" The prince explained that since they had been here, he had noticed that Rose liked to touch him, as if she had become a different person, and the girl agreed, adding that the prince had become a different person as well. After a while, the prince was finally able to put on his black shirt and thanked the girl for her help, saying that she could go now. However, Rose replied that since Albert was sick, she couldn't just leave him alone and someone had to be there for him. So she said she was only going to get a towel. Left alone in the room, Albert remembered the girl's words in which she said that the prince also seemed to have become a different person. He talked to himself about the fact that since she seemed to be a different person, he too had changed a lot. At that moment, the protagonist returned to the room, thinking she had heard something. But Albert turned away and replied that he had said nothing. The maid approached the prince and asked him not to worry about her as she was fine, and he needed a good rest, so he should forget about his business for a while. The heroine had been by the prince's side for a long time, and she had almost fallen asleep, due to the fact that it was already deep into the night, and even Albert had fallen asleep. At that moment, she's abrupt in the sense that she can't sleep, and she's also decided to get some exercise because she thinks that if she does a couple of exercises, she'll fall asleep. Also, at that moment, she remembered the magic bag and thought she'd sort through the things she'd brought from the castle, which she immediately started doing while Albert was asleep. In a little while, Rosa had already sorted out all the things that were in that bag and put this tower in order. As she sat down in the chair, she thought of Albert's surprise when he woke to find the room almost completely changed. Also looking at Albert, the heroine realized that for the first time she saw him asleep. In addition, she could not take her eyes off him because she thought that he was very handsome, even when he was asleep. She stood up abruptly as she realized that the prince might be sick, and she was thinking about how handsome he was. So she decided she'd better go and make some breakfast, The next morning, Winter approached Rosa and wondered what she was doing at such an early hour of the morning, to which the girl replied that she was just going to make porridge, which interested the dragon as it was the first time in its life it had heard of such food. And then the heroes began to prepare the food together. Also, while the rice was in the water, the girl decided to make a small omelet, and in just a couple of minutes, the omelet was ready. Winter was very curious what this omelet tasted like, and he immediately decided to try it, declaring something very delicious. He also remembered the red thing they had eaten last time. They said it was delicious, too. At that moment, Rose realized that Winter was talking about Cheyuk Pokim. She also promised her little talking pet that she'd make a lot more delicious food, but that's for later. To which Winter replied that he would look forward to every day, as nothing had ever made sense to him before. But now things had changed dramatically. When the main character heard this, she was a little touched, because the dish she was cooking was one of the reasons for her to live. Stroking the dragon, she told him that if he wanted something to eat, he should let her know, as she would make it for him. Rosie took the tray of food and went to Albert's room. Cooking took longer than she expected, and she wondered if Albert was still asleep or not. Approaching the man, the protagonist informed him that breakfast was ready, but Albert refused, saying that he did not want to move and strain himself unnecessarily, which surprised Rosa a little, as she didn't think that when you were sick, you really didn't want to lift a finger, but she still knew not to skip a meal. Blushing, she offered to help Albert, saying she would feed him and he must eat at least a little. Then the protagonist began to feed the prince, who was very surprised at the taste of this dish, saying that it was the blandest dish she had ever cooked. At that moment, the girl smilingly replied that when Albert got well, she would be sure to cook him lots of spicy food. However, the man smilingly replied that he was more to his liking, just not spicy food. Hearing this, Rose advised him to find someone whose food would be perfect for his taste when he could get out of the tower. When he heard that, the smile on Albert's face immediately disappeared, and he was unhappy with what the protagonist was saying, telling her that if she had time to say something like that, she should spend it on giving him more food. After the protagonist brings Albert more food, and he is finally able to get enough of this wonderful meal, he advises her to go to sleep, because looking at her, he realizes that she probably hasn't been lying down for a minute. However, Rose confidently declared that she had sleep in no one's eyes, so she advised the prince to go to bed quietly, as she must keep an eye on him. On hearing this, Albert immediately seized the girl's hand, saying that he would fall asleep quickly if he held her hand, and she would be with him, which surprised the protagonist, and she blushed, and didn't even know how to react, and didn't understand what was going on. Because the protagonist was very tired, as soon as she closed her eyes, she immediately fell asleep next to the prince. When she woke up in the morning and looked at Albert, she realized that his condition seemed to have improved, so she decided that he would rest a little longer, and he would be all right. Holding a pen in her hands and reading some books, Rose decided that she couldn't fall asleep now anyway, but she didn't know what to do with them. However, for some reason she felt very tired, even though she had slept a little this night, so she decided that she would only sleep for 5 minutes and get up. However, instead of sleeping for 5 minutes, Rose slept all day, and she didn't even notice how night had already fallen. Meanwhile, Albert woke up in the night, surprised that he'd slept all day. As he got up from his bed, he realized that something had probably changed in the tower, since he hadn't noticed it in the morning because of the pain. Suddenly looking to the side, he noticed the protagonist who was sleeping sweetly, and he immediately realized that the culprit of all these changes was her. Smiling, the prince realized that the maid was probably very tired from her work and decided to take a nap. He also found a sheet of paper with a to-do list on it. Namely, Rosa wrote there what she wants to do after she gets out of the tower. There, the girl wrote that she wants to walk, talk to strangers, travel, and so on. Albert knew very well that living in this tower was impossible to live a normal life, but even though it was selfish, he liked being here now. At first, he hated every movement of Rosa, but after the treaty was concluded, he gradually became accustomed to her, and finally he developed feelings for her. So he looked at Rosé sleeping sweetly and whispered that he didn't like being in the tower. He liked being here with Rosé. However, the man realized that the protagonist does not see Albert in her future, and from this thought the principal became very sad because he loves her. Approaching the girl, he asked her if she would allow him to touch her, to which he heard a positive answer. At the same moment, Albert immediately took the girl in his arms and asked the girl to keep her distance from him when they got out of here, because even after they leave the tower, Albert will still be able to find her. It was already morning, and the girl opened her eyes abruptly. She was in a state of confusion, as she did not understand what time it was and why the floor was so soft, as she remembered that she had fallen asleep on the floor. Suddenly jumping up abruptly, she starts apologizing to the prince as she thought she pushed him out of bed. However, Albert immediately began to reassure her, saying that he was actually the one who carried her off. When she heard this, Rosa immediately ran to the prince, saying that he should not have done it, as he was ill, and why should he have carried her to the bed, to which the prince replied that she looked very tired, which the girl agreed with, as she was really feeling very tired because of all the work she had done. Albert also began to praise the girl, saying that he really liked the way she decorated the room, which pleased the girl a lot. Then Rose intended to go and make breakfast, as they had eaten nothing since morning, but she immediately stopped as she felt a severe headache. She didn't understand why her head ached, and she even started to think that she might have caught the disease from Albert, but she immediately realized that Albert felt bad for another reason, and it wasn't a cold. Albert also noticed it and asked the girl if she was okay, to which the protagonist replied that she was fine, and she just got dizzy. Also waving, she promised she'd be back soon with a cooked breakfast. She was a little perplexed and didn't understand why she had a headache, as she had slept enough, so she suggested that it might have something to do with the fact that she's been languishing a little bit the last few days. Winter looked at Rosa and noticed that she didn't look her usual self today, and wondered if she was okay, but that the girl smilingly asked the dragonkin not to worry, as she just had a headache and she just needed to rest a little and it would go away. She also realized that even at work in her past life, she also had to endure similar pain. Rose then immediately started making breakfast for Albert and Winter. However, the dragonkin was very sad for some reason. After finally preparing the food and sitting down at the same table as the prince, Albert noticed that something was really wrong with Rose, so he once again asked if she was okay. Looking at Albert's beautiful eyes, Rose thought about the fact that she was used to enduring such pain. Besides, she didn't want to make Albert worry, and she just hoped it would go away. However, after a while, when Albert became Rausch, already the protagonist found herself bedridden. Putting his hand on the girl's forehead, Albert realized that she had fever, so he assumed that she might have somehow contracted it from him, since he didn't know what other reason she might have had for being so badly ill. But Rosa thought there was no way she could have contracted the disease from Albert, and she didn't understand why she suddenly felt sick. She was also shivering because she felt cold, even though the temperature in the tower was normal. Albert thought this was all very strange, because he had cast a spell to keep the magic of the tower from affecting the maid. However, the girl now rejoiced, because at least Albert was getting better. She also asked the prince if he would let her rest for a while, to which the prince replied positively, as he believes that he does not look like a man who would make a sick man work, which surprised the heroine a little, and she realized that she treated Albert like a serious boss. Alone in bed, she didn't know how Albert had managed to endure such intense pain, as if she had been hit on the head with something. However, she immediately stopped thinking about it, as she felt that right now she needed to think positively. Besides, right now she could fulfill one of the items on the blanket list, which was to do nothing and just lay around. Rosie had been confined to her bed all day, and waking up in the evening she realized that her headache had gone away a bit. She was also very corona, so she intended to go to the kitchen and eat some porridge. However, Albert immediately stopped her, asking what she intended to do, to which the girl replied that she just wanted to have dinner. Realizing what was going on, the prince approached the girl and said he would walk her to the stairs, so she needn't worry. Also stood up. He advised her to lean on him quietly, in order to make it easier for her to move around. Also, at the moment when Albert put his hands on the girl, Rose did not understand how his hands could be so tender and warm, so she thought she felt them that way because of her illness. Smiling, she joked that she was the maid that His Majesty had to help, and she wondered what people would think if they knew about it. Approaching the stairs, Albert said that the girl could go to the kitchen and he would wait here. Also, if he could only enter the kitchen, she wouldn't have to strain herself now, to which the girl smilingly replied that she would be right back, so Albert needn't worry. Entering the kitchen, the protagonist immediately met Winter, who was still very sad, and realized that his mistress was now sick. As she approached her pet, the heroine began to reassure him, saying that she would be fine and would not die, and that His Majesty was able to recover, which meant that she could too. When Winter heard that, he asked Rosa to get better, which made the protagonist very happy, and she immediately hugged the cute little dragon and promised that when she got better, she would make a lot of delicious food right away. After a while, the heroine was already at the same table with the prince, where they finally ate. Also, Rosé began to feel a little better, but she still felt weak, but it was tolerable. After that, the girl intended to go on resting in order to recover her strength more quickly. However, while climbing the stairs, she again felt a sudden headache. This pain was so strong that Rosie almost fainted. This startled Albert greatly, and he immediately ran to his maid asking what had happened to her. But the protagonist immediately stopped him, saying she was fine, and advised the prince to go on vacation, which left Albert utterly bewildered as he didn't understand how he could rest when Rose was feeling so poorly. So he hugged the girl and carried her to the bed, but the heroine didn't understand why the prince wouldn't just go to rest, since he can't help the sick, and watching her suffer is probably very painful for him. Albert was immediately surprised and approached the girl and asked her who told her he couldn't help her. He also asked her to tell him where she was in pain. At that moment, Rose, writhing in pain, said that the back of her head hurt like needles were being stabbed into it. Putting his hand on the back of the girl's head and using his magic, Albert was greatly surprised, for he felt some strange symptom, and he did not understand what disease it might be connected with. He also claimed that Rosa was exposed to black magic. Looking at the prince, the protagonist noticed that he suddenly changed his face, as if wary of something, and she was very curious about what Albert was thinking now. Bowing her head down, she said at once that she thought Albert was likely to have some suspicions about her now, which surprised Albert a little, and he seized the girl, saying that she had become very guessing lately, and he asked her to sit like that for a little while. Rose was completely puzzled and didn't understand why Albert was allowing himself so much, since he hadn't even gotten permission to touch her. However, the prince explained to the girl that he didn't have any bad intentions, and he just wanted to check something out. Then Albert started to use his magic to help relieve the pain, and he was really starting to get good at it. As Rose noticed that her headache had gone away a little and she was breathing a lot easier, at that moment Albert immediately asked the girl if she had ever heard of black magic, which surprised the girl a bit since she didn't know anything about it. Forbidden, if it's called dark, it's something bad. Besides, as soon as she woke up in this world, she was in the tower, so she's not sure she knows about it. She suddenly felt a sudden headache again, which even made her start crying and screaming in pain. Albert explained to the maid that the dark magic every day penetrated her body and took away her life force, but also this magic destroys the soul of the one who applied it. And right now, Rose is under the influence of black magic, which surprised the protagonist, and she wondered what kind of life Rosa was leading. And she began to wonder why Rostreth of all people had chosen her to imprison with the prince in that tower, which seemed very strange. At that moment, the protagonist was completely bewildered and thought that all of this, including the dark magic, was just a coincidence. At the same time, the prince was explaining to her that it was likely that while the girl was in the tower, dark magic had no effect on her, since black magic was also magic. And magic can't be used in the tower because the mages are living in the barrier. If anything's changed, it's because Rosa's left the tower. So Albert thinks that's what started the whole process. Looking Albert straight in the eye, Rosé listened with interest as Albert and more details about dark magic, what it was and why she hadn't felt it all this time. As it turned out, the protagonist managed to avoid her influence because she was in a tower, and dark magic gives up some of its life energy to become stronger. And for some reason, it was she who was affected by the black magic. The barrier preventing the use of magical powers and serving as a trap for Albert blocked her from spreading as well. But they had to leave the tower, so the effects of black magic on them began to take effect. Even though Prince said that this black magic would just give the main character a headache, it doesn't change the fact that the magic is slowly taking her life. Rose realized that the disease that was stealthily taking away her strength was scarier than she thought. In addition, the different plot from the original also led to confusion. Also, The protagonist could not understand why the novel did not say anything about Rosa being affected by black magic, even though she is a minor character. So she started to think it might have something to do with her being in her body, and it's likely that something changed in history. Whatever it was, Rose decided that she didn't want to die, and immediately asked the prince what they needed to do to get her well as soon as possible. Albert hugged Rosa sharply, replied that she needs his treatment. To be cleansed of dark magic needs Max opposite energy. But the protagonist immediately tried to stop him because she thought that this way he will overwork again. But the prince looked into the girl's eyes and answered something they main their problem now. Namely, he didn't understand how everything could coincide so fortunately. Because to get rid of dark magic, it is necessary to leave this place for a long time. And they will leave for a long time, which means that this will require a lot of effort as well as the treatment itself. Because of all this, the pain will be much stronger. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately asked Albert if he had told her all this and to make her feel remorseful, to which the prince, touching the girl's face, replied that he was leading up to the fact that at this point, whatever she did, he would have no choice but to accept it. As he pondered, Albert realized that they could also take into account another option, namely that a person could feel the effects of dark magic for two reasons. Firstly, he can be cursed by another person, and secondly, he himself can be a black magician. In the case of Rose, it cannot be a curse, because the attributes and the soul of the dark magician and the person targeted by the curse must be in one place. So the prince thinks it's more likely that the protagonist is a dark wizard, and she doesn't know it herself. Upon hearing this, Rose immediately pushed Albert away, saying that she could not believe it. But the prince began to explain to her that Rostrath, who despite his hatred dared not personally harm him, was suddenly making an alliance with the magicians. Plus, dark magicians use their life force to gain the ability to control people. When the protagonist heard this, she was completely shocked and didn't even know how to react to it. And she didn't understand how her character could be a dark mage. So she believes that her backstory is not revealed in the novel because she is a minor character. Albert suddenly added that as powers are used, dark mages weaken both physically and mentally, which explains why Rosa seems to have become a different person lately. Albert also said that memories come back and people don't change, which means that the protagonist always wanted him. Even though he had a hard time trusting other people, Albert still decided that he would try to trust Rosa, much to her surprise. He said he'd believe her, that she'd changed, and then they'd try to leave the tower again, which surprised the protagonist because she didn't know what he was thinking, since they're only bound by a contract, and when they get out of here, they'll be strangers to each other. Also, if something happens to Albert when he leaves the tower, the plot could change, even though it has already changed a bit. Also, Rose was very surprised that Albert realizes the risk, but still trusts her. At that moment, she immediately asked him where they planned to go, to which the prince replied that they would go north, as the mages shun the northern lands, and it would be easy to hide from their eyes there. In that moment of reflection, the protagonist realized that Albert had returned to the tower because he didn't want to show his weakness. But after her treatment, he would tie up again for a week. So she asked Albert if he'd be okay, since she remembered him saying he didn't like to hit on the weak in front of others. Upon hearing this, Albert immediately began to smile and reminded the girl that it was she who had advised him not to worry about his weaknesses, as it was quite normal to show them. So the prince decided to believe in this man's sincerity. While Albert was gently touching the girl's face, Rose didn't understand how he could trust her since she didn't seem like a person to trust. Besides, it hadn't been long since they'd met, so she felt like a big burden. However, Albert immediately began to reassure the girl, saying that to know the true nature of a person is easier than it seems. He also realizes that he will be very difficult to meet a person like her in the future, so he even sometimes thinks that Rose is the one he has always waited for, which touched Rosa and she blushed, not knowing why he was suddenly saying that about her. Besides, even the original didn't say if Albert ever wanted to meet his true love. Staring into each other's eyes, Albert realized that his words might be a bit burdensome for Rose, and it was because she was still thinking about getting away from him, but the prince couldn't break up with her. At the same time, the protagonist was completely bewildered and did not understand anything, but she could not resist Albert in any way. And finally, after Albert said he'd give up everything for her, they kissed passionately. It had been a few days since that kiss, and Albert was already on his way up to Rose, holding a magic wand in his hands. As the prince approached the girl, he reminded her that when they left the tower, the pain might intensify, and the dark magic that was outside would probably take effect with renewed vigor. Rose had already made her final decision, and after she agreed to leave the tower to get rid of the dark magic, she decided to give the guards 2 weeks' worth of reports, which they accepted because of her friendship with them. And since she was ill, Albert wrote 2 reports copying her handwriting in her place. Now all she had to do was make sure the treatment went well so she could finally get rid of the dark magic. Holding the dragon in his hands, Winter smilingly stated that Rose had now switched places with Albert, which amused the girl a little. She replied that he was right, and that was why they were leaving now, to fix her up. Suddenly, Albert looked at the girl and said that it was time for them to go back. So grabbing each other's hands, the prince began to use a spell to open the portal. Being outside the tower, Albert immediately picked up the girl, saying that it would be quicker for them, and they immediately flew northward. Suddenly, the maid noticed that they were flying at a very great speed, that she was even a little afraid, and she closed her eyes. Noticing this, Albert advised her not to look down if she was afraid of heights, but to look up at him. Hearing this, Rose was a little surprised at his words and didn't understand how he could say it so easily. She also wondered if he even understood what she was feeling right now. Also, the main character is sure that he understands how his words make her heart beat, because Albert is the kind of person who knows how to approach people. Suddenly looking at the prince, the heroine said that he looked great today. She also knew very well that her words would make his heart beat as much as hers, but that didn't mean that he didn't like compliments. Albert was a little surprised by this compliment and asked what it was about, to which Rose replied that she just wanted to catch the prince by surprise and see his reaction, since every time she was the only one at a loss. Smirking, Albert immediately explained to her that to take him by surprise, there was another way which immediately interested the girl, and she told him that if he told her about it, she could finally surprise him. Coming very close to the girl's face, Albert declared confidently that she simply had to become his, which greatly surprised Rosa, and showing her palm, they asked him not to tease her in that way. Just as Albert thought, the protagonist doesn't agree yet, so he realizes that he has to try even harder. At that moment, the protagonist thought it was obvious, since he had become so reckless because he was so lonely in the tower. After a while, Vergennes and Duke Mason, who was in the castle, noticed the protagonists flying towards them, and were very surprised by it. On landing, the protagonist was very embarrassed, and said that she would be able to move on her own, to which Albert replied that she should be closer to him, so that he could contain the black magic, because being with him the whole flight made her feel lighter. Rosé also felt very uncomfortable looking at the Duke and the Baron, as they probably didn't like the fact that the prince was treating his maid so well. Plus, they probably think she's an evil and conniving maid who only wants to do harm. Looking at his friends, the prince immediately explained to them that he understood that they were expecting him to explain right now, but he didn't have time for that right now. He also said that he had trusted them, and now it was time for them to trust him. Looking at the Baron and the Duke, the protagonist realized that they were probably very shocked by this now. She also realized that while Albert treated her, they would have to stay here until she recovered, and then return to the tower. Suddenly the dragon woke up, and he too noticed that the Baron and Duke were countries. Besides, Winter advised the girl to get well soon since she promised him to go on a trip with him. After a while, the heroine was already in the castle, where she listened to the Duke asking the prince if he really intended to cure Rose of black magic, to which Albert replied in the affirmative and advised Mason to go out and barricade the room, to which the Duke replied that he had prepared the room as Albert had requested. But he wondered if the prince really wanted to do it, as it would cost him a great deal of effort to do so. At that moment, Albert turned away and smirkingly answered that he used to be, after all, that strong retard of a duke, since it was the first time he had seen the prince so. Albert also added that what had happened to him was related to dark magic, and it would be better for him to deal with it himself, as he felt it was the right thing to do. At that moment, the Duke immediately apologized for his doubts adding that even when they tortured one of the mages, none of them said anything. Albert was already tired of this useless chatter and said that the Duke had nothing to apologize for, and now he had better go out. Left alone in the room with the protagonist, he said that it was time for them to start the treatment, but first of all, they should get rid of the dragon, which shocked Rosa, and she panicked and immediately began to explain that Winter wasn't a thing, but a living being. However, Albert immediately explained to her that he did not mean to deal with him, but just to drive him away, because before the treatment, it was necessary to reduce and minimize the number of living creatures in the room. And this is the main condition. The prince also added that if Winter doesn't leave, the treatment may not work properly, which could cause the chance of the protagonist dying to increase greatly. When the dragon heard this, he ran out of the room in tears because he didn't want anything to happen to his mistress. The maid also wondered why Albert disliked Winter so much, to which the man replied that he had no good memories of dragons, which interested the girl even more, and she wondered if he'd seen an adult dragon before, to which Albert, with a serious face, replied positively, when he was only 8 years old, he saw a white dragon.